Zayn sank into his office chair, his fingers massaging his temples as the flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead cast long shadows across the room. The numbers on the employee performance reports blurred in front of his eyes. None of it made sense. One warehouse, in particular, had spiraled into chaos. Turnover rates on the night shift were soaring. Customer complaints were flooding in, and productivity had dropped to an all-time low. Every report he received echoed the same hollow excuses. It's the workload, or people don't want to work nights. But Zayn knew better. These weren't just data points. They were warning signs. He wasn't a stranger to hard work. He'd built this company from nothing, starting with a single warehouse and a dream forged in sweat and sacrifice. Now it had grown into a chain of 9 bustling locations, so why was only this one collapsing? He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was rotten beneath the surface, something the numbers couldn't reveal, and there was only one way to find out the truth. That night, Zayn made a decision that would alter everything. A few days later, long after the city had gone quiet, Zayn slipped into the warehouse just before midnight. The transformation was complete. Gone was the polished CEO with tailored suits and a spotless watch. In his place stood a man in a gray hoodie, scuffed work boots, and a cap that had seen better days. His beard was gone, his sharp features bare, and his expensive watch replaced with a cheap one he'd grabbed at a gas station. He had erased every visible sign of his status. No one here had ever seen him in person. His face was a myth to most employees, known only to the upper echelons of management, and they rarely stepped foot onto the warehouse floor. This warehouse, one of the newest in his network, was supposed to be a beacon of growth. Instead, it had become a dark spot he couldn't ignore. Greg, the night shift manager, a burly man with a permanent scowl, didn't spare him a second glance. "You the new guy?" he asked, handing Zayn a clipboard without waiting for an answer. "Yet," Zayn replied, voice calm, hiding every trace of familiarity. "Just trying to make some extra cash." Greg scoffed. "You and everyone else, just don't slow us down." And with that, Zayn was swallowed into the midnight rhythm of the warehouse. He was paired with Lucas, a wiry young man with tired eyes and the robotic precision of someone who had long since learned to shut down emotion just to survive the night. The loading dock buzzed with machinery and muffled grunts, the air thick with the smell of sweat and cardboard. Under the dim lighting, everything felt heavier. Every box, every breath. Lucas handed Zayn a barcode scanner. "Watch me for a bit, then it's your turn." Zayn nodded, eyes following the swift efficiency of Lucas's movements. It looked simple. Scan, sort, stack. But when Zayn took over, the illusion shattered. The packages were deceptively heavy, and the repetition quickly wore his muscles down. Within hours, his back throbbed and his arms screamed with fatigue. He had always respected his workers, but nothing could have prepared him for the brutal, grinding nature of the work they endured night after night. And yet, the physical exhaustion wasn't what disturbed him most. Greg barely made his rounds. When he did emerge from his office, it was only to bark orders or belittle someone for falling behind. The air carried more than just dust and sweat. It was laced with something heavier, something invisible but suffocating. The workers moved like ghosts, their faces hollow, their conversations reduced to mere murmurs. That's when he saw her. A young woman, barely into her 20s, sat alone on an overturned crate in the far corner of the warehouse. Her shoulders trembled as she clutched her knees, her breathing jagged and unsteady. Tears streamed down her cheeks, unchecked. Zayn froze. This wasn't ordinary fatigue. This was something deeper. Despair. Lucas caught him staring and sighed heavily. "That's Lily. She's been pulling doubles all week. Management says we're short, but they won't hire anyone." He heard a wild whisper. "We're not bad?" Zayn asked, though his voice barely rose above a whisper. Lucas met his eyes, a mixture of frustration and resignation darkening his gaze. Because Greg says it's cheaper this way. Something inside Zayn snapped, quietly, inwardly. It was a slow burn, cold and calculated. Rage curled in his gut, but he held it in. Reacting now would blow his cover and risk everything. No, he had to see more. Understand fully. Only then could he destroy the rot from within. He took a deep breath, masking the storm inside. This was no longer about fixing numbers or filing reports. This was personal, and he was going to make it right, even if it meant breaking the system he had helped build. Zayn pressed on through the shift, forcing his aching body to move in rhythm with Lucas and the rest of the crew, though his mind was elsewhere, watching, absorbing, analyzing. Each movement around him felt wrapped in silent tension. He caught glimpses of Lily dragging herself back to her feet, forcing her limbs to cooperate despite every muscle protesting. No one offered her a hand. No one asked if she was okay. It was as if everyone had grown numb to suffering, as if this level of burnout had become part of the job description. That realization pierced Zayn deeper than any spreadsheet ever could. As hours passed in slow, grinding motion, Zayn began to notice a disturbing pattern. Conversations between workers were kept to a bare minimum, just enough to get the job done. There were no jokes, no camaraderie, no shared glances of encouragement. The air felt heavy, saturated with unspoken rules and silent fear. And then, like a recurring shadow, Greg reappeared. He didn't check on anyone's well-being. His eyes didn't register faces, only errors. He prowled the floor like a predator, looking not for opportunities to support, but for mistakes to pounce on. At one point, he stopped near a young man who had accidentally stacked a pallet slightly out of alignment. Greg raised his voice sharply, not just correcting the mistake, but publicly shaming him. The man muttered an apology and fixed it, his face blank, as if his soul had gone into hiding long ago. Zayn clenched his jaw so tight it hurt. This wasn't management. It was intimidation cloaked in authority. By the time the night shift dragged to its weary end, Zayn felt as if he'd been beaten with every box he had lifted. It wasn't just the physical toll, it was psychological. He'd worked hard labor in his youth, but this was different. These workers weren't simply tired. They were hollowed out, like the life was slowly being drained from them by something they couldn't quite name. Greg gathered everyone on the floor at the end of the shift. He stood before them like a general addressing troops, arms crossed, tone detached. He recited shipment statistics, quotas, hit or missed, but not once did he acknowledge the human effort behind those numbers. There was no appreciation, no encouragement, only a warning that mistakes would not be tolerated. As the group dispersed, Lucas murmured something under his breath. Zayn didn't catch it all, but he didn't need to. He could feel the weight behind it. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a breath of freedom. He watched as workers shuffled to their cars like ghosts escaping a haunted house. Near the entrance, Lily sat on a bench, staring at the ground like it was the only solid thing left in her life. Zayn approached quietly. He kept his tone casual, asking how long she'd been working such brutal hours. She hesitated, eyes darting like someone unsure if honesty was safe. Finally, she explained she had been hired as a part-time employee, but gradually the shifts grew longer. Saying no was never an option. Those who refused were punished silently. Less hours, suddenly vanishing from the schedule. Greg didn't need to say the words. Everyone understood. Fall in line or disappear. Something inside Zayn locked into place. This wasn't mismanagement, it was exploitation. Lily admitted she had been trying to find another job, but options were slim. Until then, she had no choice but to endure. Zayn nodded, masking the fire rising in his chest. He thanked her, told her to hang in there. She smiled faintly, an expression so faint and frayed it barely resembled joy, before slipping into the shadows like the rest. By the time he reached his car, his mind was set. This wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about justice. The next night, Zayn returned, but not undercover. He entered the warehouse with the confidence of a man who no longer needed to hide. His steps were deliberate, his face unshaven but his eyes sharp. He didn't stop at the loading dock. He didn't slow at the conveyor lines. He marched straight to the heart of the floor. The workers paused, confused. There was something off about him, something unfamiliar in the way he carried himself. Lucas froze mid-lift, watching him. Then Zayn spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, steady and quiet, rang louder than any scream. He introduced himself, not as a new hire, but as the founder and CEO of the company. For a moment, silence, then shock, then a collective realization, rippling through the room like electricity. Greg's office door flung open. His face was a storm cloud, ready to strike, until his eyes met Zayn's. And then he stopped. His words dried in his mouth as his brain scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing. Zayn didn't hesitate. He laid out everything he had witnessed, the back-breaking overtime, the emotional neglect, the toxic culture cultivated under Greg's rule. He spoke of Lily's pain, of the threats hidden in scheduling, of the fear that soaked every interaction like spilled oil. Greg tried to fight back. He stood tall, arms folded, and blamed the numbers, the quotas, the need to push hard to stay competitive. But Zayn didn't blink. He stared him down, unwavering. The workers listened. For the first time in a long time, they looked at each other, not in fear, but in awakening. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't the problem. Maybe they had never been. When Zayn asked why hiring more staff had been avoided, Greg's mask cracked. He admitted he had slashed labor costs to boost his own performance reports. He had gambled with people's lives to polish numbers. He assumed no one would look too closely. He was wrong. Zayn turned to the workers, his voice filled with both anger and resolve. This ended now. The forced overtime, the silence, the abuse. Change was coming, and it would begin with him. Zayn stood in the center of the warehouse floor, his presence no longer a secret. His voice was calm, deliberate, yet carried the weight of finality as he addressed everyone again. There would be no more fear-based leadership here. Mandatory overtime? Immediately re-evaluated. A full hiring initiative? Already underway. But most importantly, this warehouse would no longer run on exhaustion and silence. It would run on dignity and respect. Then he turned to Greg. His voice didn't rise, but the shift in tone was unmistakable. A quiet storm rolling in. Greg was relieved of duty, effective immediately. His tenure, marked by fear, manipulation, and neglect, had ended. It hadn't just failed the workers, it had endangered everything Zayn had built from the ground up. Greg tried to defend himself, words stumbling from his lips like broken gears, but Zayn didn't entertain them. This was no longer a conversation. It was a reckoning. Hush fell over the warehouse. Some employees still looked wary, eyes scanning the room as if waiting for the hammer to drop, but others, Lucas, Lily, and those who had borne the brunt of this broken system, finally exhaled, a quiet sigh of relief. It wasn't celebration, not yet, but it was the first breath of something new. Zayn didn't walk away after delivering his verdict. He stayed. He spent hours moving from worker to worker, asking questions, listening not as a CEO but as a fellow human. This wasn't a PR stunt. It was a reckoning with his own blind spots. For years, he had trusted the system to self-correct, but now he knew better. Trust didn't live on spreadsheets. It lived on the floor. As the night wore on, The warehouse felt lighter, not fixed, not yet, but changed. A current of uncertainty remained, understandable after months, years of mistreatment. Change would have to be proven, not promised. Zayn was ready to prove it. He stayed even after most had clocked out. With a notebook in hand, he walked the aisles, pausing to speak with those who had lingered behind. Slowly, stories surfaced. Workers spoke of faulty equipment, unsafe night operations, and scheduling systems that left no room for emergencies or rest. The fear of speaking up melted as they saw him not judging, but writing, asking, listening. Rai, a veteran forklift operator with silver in his beard and wisdom in his eyes, spoke of being forced to cover shifts beyond his training. It wasn't just inefficient, it was dangerous. One wrong stack could turn deadly. Lucas brought up the outdated scanners that glitched constantly, causing delays and errors that made them look incompetent. Management, he said, had ignored all requests for replacements. They weren't just understaffed, they were under-equipped. Lily, still clearly recovering, admitted something heartbreaking. The morale had been low for so long, most workers didn't even dream of improvement. They stayed because there was nowhere else to go. By the time the next shift arrived, Zayn had filled pages with notes. Not numbers, names, voices, truths. He called the workers together again. This time, not in the cold open space of the floor, but in the break room, a place once haunted by silence. Now, it held the beginning of something sacred. Trust. He spoke as someone who had seen their struggles firsthand. Immediate reforms would begin, hiring more staff to balance the workload, revising the overtime policy so no one was forced into 14-hour marathons, replacing faulty scanners, servicing forklifts, and prioritizing safety procedures. And most importantly, leadership would change. The new warehouse manager would be someone who understood people, not just productivity. Until then, Zayn himself would oversee the transition, not from a boardroom, but from the floor. The workers listened, some skeptical, others cautiously hopeful. They had been promised change before, but this time, it didn't come through memos. It came from someone who had lifted their boxes, walked in their exhaustion, and felt their despair. After the meeting, Zayn called his corporate team. The hiring push would start immediately. Then he scheduled meetings with every other warehouse manager in his network. If this problem had rotted one site, it might have infected others. He was done waiting for reports to tell him what workers were already living. Over the next several weeks, transformation took root. New hires began filling shifts. The relentless pressure eased. Lily was granted a lighter schedule, allowing her to rest and rebuild her strength. Lucas was promoted to a supervisory role, a voice for the workers on the ground. Rai was placed in charge of safety training and operations. His decades of experience no longer ignored, but honored. But the biggest change wasn't in procedures. It was in spirit. Where once there was silence, there were now conversations. Workers exchanging ideas, asking questions, even laughing. They didn't just survive their shifts, they owned them. Zayn continued his visits, never distant, always within reach, watching, listening, learning. One night, he walked the warehouse again. He passed through newly organized aisles, heard the hum of well-maintained machinery, and noticed something that caught his breath. Lily, once hunched over in tears, was laughing, truly laughing, at something Lucas had said. It wasn't polite or strained, it was real. That was when Zayn knew. This had never just been about fixing broken policies, it was about restoring what the numbers had never measured, human dignity. He came back early the next evening, before the shift began, just to observe. The warehouse still had its challenges, but now it moved with rhythm and purpose. Maintenance teams checked equipment. Clerks prepared inventories. Early arrivals chatted softly over coffee. A new energy filled the space, one rooted not in fear, but in belonging. In the back, Zayn found Rai overseeing a shipment. Their eyes met, and for the first time since this began, Zayn felt something settled in his chest, a quiet certainty. This wasn't just a warehouse anymore. It was a second chance. And Zayn had made it happen, not from behind a desk, but by stepping into the shadows and standing beside the very people who built his empire, box by box, hour by hour. Rai had taken to his new responsibilities with a quiet confidence that radiated through the floor. Where once rules had been barked as threats, now safety protocols were practiced with mutual respect. He didn't hover or nitpick. He educated, guided. As Zayn entered the warehouse, Rai offered a respectful nod before turning back to instruct a newer worker on how to properly secure a heavy pallet. It was a simple exchange, but one full of dignity. Zayn paused, watching from a distance. Rai had always had the knowledge. What he lacked before was permission, and now, with the right structure in place, he had the authority to lead without fear, and others were following that lead willingly. There was an air of balance now, structure without oppression, accountability without dread. Moments later, Lucas stepped into view, clipboard in hand. He had embraced his new role quickly, though traces of his working-class roots clung to him in the best ways. There was a sharpness in his eyes that came from experience, from years of grinding through late shifts and overlooked efforts. He checked on each team with care, offering guidance and direction, not oversight dressed in suspicion. He was trusted because he had once stood shoulder to shoulder with these same people. Zayn motioned him over, and they stepped aside near a row of storage racks. Lucas spoke first, noting the gradual lift in morale. People were talking more, smiling more, but he didn't sugarcoat the truth. Some workers still moved with hesitation. They had endured so much under Greg that change still felt like something too fragile to believe in. Zayn nodded. He knew trust wasn't a light switch. It had to be rebuilt brick by brick. Then came the name on both their minds. Lily. Zayn asked how she was really doing. Lucas paused, clearly weighing his response. "She's better, but she's still recovering," he said carefully. "The burnout doesn't go away just because the hours got better. You can't undo that kind of exhaustion overnight." Zayn nodded again, silently registering the weight of that truth. It wasn't enough to remove the pain. They had to help people heal from it. He found Lily near the break room, focused on a shipment checklist. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm but guarded. There was no hostility, just the kind of neutrality that comes when someone is still deciding whether to hope again. Zayn didn't approach her like a boss. He came to her like someone who'd seen her pain and hadn't forgotten it. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Lily didn't sugarcoat it. "Better. But I'm still not sure if this is where I want to be long-term." Her voice was even, but her words held the weight of long-buried fatigue. "It's better, yeah. But after everything, I'm not sure if it's enough." Zayn appreciated the honesty more than she knew. He told her gently, "That's your choice now. No one will pressure you to stay or go. That ends with Greg. But if you choose to stay, know this. You're not just filling a shift. You were brave when things were darkest. You spoke up when no one else could. Your voice helped create this change, and it still matters here." Lily looked at him for a long moment. There was no immediate reply, no cinematic smile. Just a subtle nod, a gesture that meant maybe, just maybe, she was willing to try. As Zayn walked back to the floor, a quiet sense of clarity settled in. Fixing what was broken wasn't just about removing a toxic leader. It was about creating the kind of culture where that toxicity couldn't take root again. This warehouse had been a wake-up call, a glaring red flag he had nearly missed. If it had happened here, it could happen elsewhere. And that realization haunted him, because responsibility didn't end with repair. It demanded vigilance. There was still more to be done. But something fundamental had shifted. Zayn had crossed the line between being a builder of systems to a restorer of people. And that made all the difference.